is exactly where it's going to take off. But before I do that, I just thought of two comments to begin with while Susan was speaking. The first is Susan asked me if I was going to speak in English or German. I am going to speak in English, but please do ask questions in German so that I can prove to my German teacher, who's sitting in the room, that from 15 years ago, that actually I have mastered some German in the meantime. That would be a pleasure. The second thought that I had, which I did not think about while I was writing this paper, is that I actually saw Cavell exactly once in my life, also 15 years ago approximately, at the Harvard Film Archive. I don't know how many people here know this institution. I just went to watch a movie, an old American movie, and before the movie, an old man jumped on the stage and gave what seemed like a jazz-like lecture on the meaning of marriage in Hollywood. And it was one of the most brilliant performances that I've seen, certainly for a philosopher. I had no clue who that person was. And going out of the movie after that, I remember asking people, so what was that? And of course, all the Harvard students, I was not one of them, were looking at me thinking that I must be mad if I have no clue who that was. Anyway, that was my experience with Cavell. Now to the paper. When Susan asked me in the summer if I might have an essay on Cavell for a workshop of this kind, I answered her truthfully that I know nothing about Cavell, really almost nothing about Cavell, but I may have in me some thoughts on Cavell as an American philosopher, one who is in a way not less relevant as an American political philosopher even than the obvious names on America's catalog of political thinkers, say Rawls or Rorty. Susan answered, a little bit in line of what she just mentioned here, you know how much I admired Cavell, but I'm critical of his apolitical attitude. Perhaps something can be said about how his apolitical approach to philosophy is his American approach to philosophy, but still at the bottom, he is frustratingly apolitical. And Susan went on to quote from memory Cavell's statement in Little Did I Know, a statement that she just repeated. So here I will repeat it for you as well, not from Susan's memory, but now from the book. There are two types of thinkers, those who are primarily political and those whose instinct is psychological. If there are two kinds of thinkers of this sort, then I suppose I belong to the latter kind, that is, the psychological. So if Cavell is in some sense the American philosopher, then this philosophy is in some sense psychological, not political. Now we all know Rawls's interpretation of American liberalism through this famous slogan, political, not metaphysical. Political, not metaphysical. People sometimes cherish this anti-metaphysics. I, on my part, cannot decide whether I think it's a symptom or a cause of much of the political madness that we've been witnessing around us. And I've spoken about this at the Einstein Forum, not last summer, but the summer before. Now, I will not say much about this post-metaphysics in this paper, but the upshot of my brisk reading of Cavell's Cartesianism is that his statement, if you'd like to call it that, psychological, not political, can be read as a playful quote, ironically twisting Rawls's political, not metaphysical slogan. For the upshot of what I'm going to suggest is that when Cavell says psychological, he actually means something deeply metaphysical. Specifically, in light of his dialogue with Descartes, psychology emerges as a metaphysics of the American mind, but metaphysics in a strong sense of the term. This is a metaphysics that Cavell knows, and we will see that, demands a politics. And so, psychological, not political, ironically means political because metaphysical. In this way, or in a way, this should have been or could have been obvious. Cavell does read America as the ultimate tragic subject, but what is tragedy if not the playing out of metaphysics in the realm of politics? And now, in slightly less promissory fashion. In democracy in America, Tocqueville argues that Americans are the world's least philosophical nation because they are the most Cartesian. That is, Americans are perfect followers of Descartes, he says, and therefore are not philosophical at all. Paradoxically, perhaps, Americans' Cartesian individual rationalism, this is how he understands Descartes, accepting no authority over thinking but their own minds, will end up undermining a genuine freedom of thought, thereby leading to the tyranny of the masses. So important for us, the famous Tocquevillian thesis about the tyranny of the masses is actually grounded in his ascription of Cartesianism to the Americans. I want to suggest that we can read Cavell's elaborate confrontation with Descartes as at least de facto dealing with Tocqueville's claim that the American mind is tyrannically Cartesian. To be sure, I do not think that Cavell was conscious of this confrontation with Tocqueville, but there is textual evidence, we will see at the end of the paper, that his understanding of America is directly linked to his interpretation of Descartes, and in any case, Cavell's reading of Descartes is consciously following Emerson's, and Emerson, this Cavell probably overlooked, was in dialogue with Tocqueville's understanding of Americans as Cartesians. For Cavell's Emerson, the tyranny of the masses, Emerson calls it conformism and treats it as a political metaphysical problem, does not arise from Cartesianism. Just the contrary, it arises from the failure to live up to the genius of the Cartesian spirit, self-creation or self-reliance, getting stuck in metaphysical skepticism, and what such metaphysical skepticism may mean we'll have to explain below. The American tragedy is interpreted by Cavell as a consequence of such skepticism. All right, so a few words on Tocqueville. Tocqueville's claim that Americans' Cartesian attitude would lead to a tyranny of the masses runs roughly as follows. First, he identifies Cartesianism with a certain interpretation of what he takes the cogito to be supposedly all about, and which we might call individual rationalism, the idea that there is no authority over truth or the quality of a given thought beyond each person's thinking. If there is no such further authority, and in this sense, no standard or measure that's independent of each individual mind, then all minds are de facto equal. Descartes' rational individualism thus leads to, quote from Tocqueville, the doctrine of equality applied to minds. The doctrine of equality applied to minds. Now, if all thoughts are considered equal, then all mediocre and false thoughts are as good as any other. A sense of guidance is lost, the guidance of great thinkers of the present, and perhaps more significantly, the guidance of the great thinkers of the past. But the argument goes, no serious thinking can be cultivated without a relation to such guidance of past thinking, and Tocqueville makes this point perhaps most succinctly when describing Americans' Cartesian attitude or Cartesian relation to Descartes himself. Precisely because Americans are Cartesian, he writes, they do not know who Descartes was. Certainly they haven't read him. And here's a quote from Democracy in America, quote, "If I go look for the philosophical principle that can sum up nearly all others, I discover that in most operations of the mind, each American appeals only to the individual effort of his reason. So America is one of the countries in the world where the precepts of Descartes are least studied and best followed. That should not be a surprise. Americans do not read the works of Descartes." Actually, listen to that paragraph because that moment here is important. Americans do not read the works of Descartes because their social condition diverts them from speculative studies, and they follow his maxims because the same social state naturally disposes their mind to adopt them. So the Americans did not need to draw their philosophical method from books. They have found it within themselves, end quote. Now, since all thoughts are considered equal, and no authority independent of each person's thinking is available, the only possible political or public standard of judging the true or the good is what many people come to actually agree about. In this way, from the doctrine of the equality of minds follows the thought that, this is another quote from Tocqueville, there is more enlightenment and wisdom in many men combined than in one single individual. That is, the possibility that an excellent individual, a philosopher presumably, could come to know an independent truth, independent and yet universally valid, has been undermined by Cartesianism. It has been undermined by Descartes' cogito, thanks to Tocqueville. Which in turn leads to a tyranny, and arguably the worst tyranny of all, the tyranny of the masses.
Can you just repeat those last two sentences? I'm trying to understand.
Sure.
I don't know if I'm the only one.
Since all thoughts are considered equal and no authority independent of a person's thinking is available, the only possible political or public standard of judgment of what is true or what is good is what many people come to actually agree about. So there's only one standard, right? Because the only standard available for thinking is what the masses agree about. You get from individual, so you got from the thought that the only authority over thinking is my individual mind to the doctrine of the equality of all thoughts. And given that this is the case, there can be no standard other than what we might actually agree about. Right? There's no independent standard. Which in turn leads to a tyranny, and arguably the worst tyranny of all, namely the tyranny of the masses. For it implies, and maybe this will be helpful, that the majority's standard of judgment can be enforced not just by physical threats, but by alleged moral authority. Where minds weren't equal, where thinking was a task that's invested with a power that's independent of each person's individual mind, individual opinion, if you'd like to emphasize that, the true and the good could exercise their own authority. Indeed, this independence or priority is just the meaning of this authority being metaphysical, and as metaphysical, this authority was independent also of the wills of the old tyrants and kings. But where all individual thinking is equal, where a higher metaphysical authority is denied, the only standard that can normatively direct thinking and politics is what the opinion of many mediocre thinkers happens to converge about. Since there is no independent measure, the impoverished consensus of the people has the power to censor not just what people say, as all tyrants used to do, but also what they think or will, which all tyrants could never quite achieve. Cartesian individual rationalism appears here as the origin of post-metaphysical liberal thinking, and such post-metaphysical liberalism, allegedly devised to guard the freedom of thought, is interpreted by Tocqueville as an invitation to intellectual slavery. As he puts it in a passage that in 1944, Adorno and Horkheimer would incorporate into the dialectic of enlightenment, quote, chains and executioners, those are the crude instruments formerly used by tyranny. But today, civilization has perfected even despotism itself. Monarchs had materialized oppression. The democratic republics of the present day have rendered it, Passau, an entirely affair of the mind. We are not materializing oppression, but have made it an entirely affair of the mind. Under the absolute sway of one man, the body was attacked in order to subdue the soul. Such is not the course adopted by tyranny in democratic republics. There, the body is left free, and the soul is enslaved. Tocqueville accordingly writes that he knows no country in the world where, quote, there reigns less independence of mind and true freedom of discussion than in America. And if, through Cartesianism, oppression has indeed become an entirely affair of the mind, this could only be expected. However, since democracy is only possible or sustainable if the people constitute a thinking public, that's a familiar democratic assumption, Cartesianism poses a genuine threat. Quote, if liberty, this is Tocqueville, if liberty is ever lost in America, it will not be through the political maladies of anarchy, but by the tyrannical, quote, omnipotence of the majority. So here's a question. Can we read Cavell's Auseinandersetzung with Descartes as somehow responding to Tocqueville's interpretation of the American mind as tyrannically Cartesian? And as I said, I don't think that we can do so quite so simply, but indirectly perhaps we can. That is through Cavell's essay, Being Odd, Getting Even, an interpretation of Descartes in Emerson's classic American text, Self-Reliance. This is basically what I'm going to do from now on. I'm going to more or less interpret Cavell in Self-Reliance. Cavell more or less opens his essay by pointing out that at the very foundation of Emerson's Self-Reliance lies a quote from Descartes, namely the pronouncement of the cogito. And here's Emerson's text as quoted by Cavell. Quote, man is timid and apologetic. He is no longer upright. He dares not say, I think, I am, but quote some saint or sage. Man is timid and apologetic. He is no longer upright. He dares not say, I think, I exist, but quote some saint or sage. At first, this may not seem like much of a quote of Descartes' cogito, which is often remembered through the slogan, I think, therefore I am. But as Cavell correctly points out, Emerson's text contains a direct reference to Descartes' official formulation of the cogito in the second meditation, where the infamous therefore never appears. In the second meditation, the meditator asserts, quote, I am, I exist, is necessarily true every time that I pronounce it or conceive it in my mind. Emerson is basically saying in the quote, no one has the courage to pronounce the cogito. No one dares say, I think I am. Rather, everyone only quotes someone else who had already said it. And that's not enough. According to Cavell, Emerson's insistence on the saying or the pronouncing of the cogito is, quote, precisely faithful to Descartes' main insight. And he proceeds on this basis to provide a, I think we can say, radical interpretation of Emerson's radical interpretation of Descartes. But in all of this radicalness, one that I submit indeed is faithful to Descartes, just as much as it contradicts the whole tradition of American Descartes interpretation from Charles Peirce up to analytic philosophy or Rorty, in the mirror of nature, say. At the core of this interpretation is Descartes' realization, Cavell writes, that, quote, human existence must declare itself. And I'm still quoting, if I am to exist, I must name my existence, end quote. Cavell thinks this is captured by Jaakko Hintika's and Bernard Williams's well-known interpretations, which elaborate on the cogito as a performance rather than an inference. The therefore of the cogito, I think, therefore I am, drops out from their interpretations, basically, and the act of explicitly avowing my existence becomes somehow the cogito's ground. I take it the professional philosophers here are familiar with this literature, and we don't need to enter it here. However, following Emerson, Cavell takes this performative aspect much beyond Hintika's familiar account. For Hintika, as for other more or less polite Descartes interpreters, the Cartesian question was, how can I come to be certain? That is, how can I come to know that I exist? And my existence was supposed then to function as a bit of certain knowledge that allegedly functioned as a foundation of certain epistemology. For Cavell, however, When Emerson's Descartes understands that, this was a quote, if I am to exist, I must name my existence, he isn't dealing with epistemology at all, but with metaphysics. He's not saying, if I am to know that I exist, I am to name my existence, but rather, if I am to exist, I am to declare my existence. Emerson's Descartes asserts that I exist because I think, not that I know that I exist because I think, or know that I do. Now, I believe that this unorthodox metaphysical reading or metaphysical understanding of Descartes' cogito can and needs to be defended as Descartes' actual position in the Meditations. Of course, this is a complex scholarly issue, and this is not our business here. But let me at least motivate it here by a brief passage from Descartes' second meditation. Here is a quote from Descartes. I am, I exist, that is certain. But for how long do I exist? For as long as I think. For it might perhaps happen, and this is the important part, if I totally ceased thinking, that I would at the same time completely cease to be. As Cavell points out, Descartes' cogito establishes that I exist, quote, only while, or if and only if, I think. Which in turn introduces a twist in the story, and a twist which Cavell thinks Emerson's self-reliance is all about, namely the question, what happens if I do not think? Or slightly more specifically here, if we interpret the cogito through the insight that if I am to be, I am to name or pronounce my existence, what happens if I do not say I am, I exist, or conceive this in my mind? What happens, for example, if I merely quote this from some saint or sage or from some book? The Meditations. Before we answer this question, it is useful to say at least a word about the importance of quoting in this moment. Cavell is right to point out in the essay that there is an irony, he calls it a gag, in Emerson's text. When Emerson complains that everyone merely quotes rather than assert, I think, I exist, he himself, Emerson, actually quotes Descartes' cogito, and he does so consciously. But I want to suggest that the irony here is even more powerful. By quoting Descartes, Emerson alludes not just to Descartes, but also to a thinker that he does not quote at all, namely Tocqueville. Recall that Tocqueville had argued that Americans are, this was a quote, right, perfectly Cartesian and therefore least philosophical. They follow Descartes, but just for this reason don't even, quote, read his works or take his thinking from books. And just to be sure, the history here is perfectly sound in terms of the dates and of what Emerson did read and did not read. Well, this American, Emerson, quoting Descartes, complains that no one has the courage to actually individually pronounce, I think I exist. Everyone merely quotes this from some book or some sage, which in turn creates a metaphysical problem. Merely quoting is not asserting or pronouncing, I think I exist. Strictly speaking, it amounts to failing to exist. Now, Cavell is fully aware that this result, the failure to exist, may sound odd or even nonsensical to analytical philosophers who can only treat the cogito as an epistemological issue and, quote from Cavell, surely not in the sense that the saying or the thinking can create my existence. Still, he insists that Emerson is true here to Descartes, and if anything, that we should radicalize the Cartesian insight. Quote from Cavell, Emerson goes the whole way with Descartes' insight that I exist only if I think, but he thereupon denies that I mostly do think, that the I mostly gets into my thinking, as it were. From this it follows that the skeptical possibility is realized, that I do not exist, that I, as it were, haunt the world, end quote. The problem with the American mind, for Cavell's Emerson, isn't that it is too Cartesian, it's individual rationalism. If anything, the problem is that it is not Cartesian enough. Instead of following Descartes properly, Americans quote him, merely quote him, which is not the same thing as pronouncing the cogito. Daring to follow Descartes' genius would imply not just quoting the way he pronounced the cogito, but pronouncing the cogito and possibly going beyond Descartes. And this is exactly what Emerson does in Self-Reliance by attacking Descartes' claim, in the third meditation now, that because he is not God, he cannot be the creator of his own existence. Recall, here is a line from Descartes' third meditation, quote, "I pass now to consider whether I myself, who have the idea of God, could exist if there had been no God. From what source would I have derived my existence? Possibly from myself. But if I were the author of my being, I would doubt nothing." So if I were the author of my own existence, the argument goes, I would be so self-sufficient that I'd have no ability to doubt. But I do doubt, and therefore I'm not the author of my existence. God is. That's the Cartesian argument in the third meditation, or part of the Cartesian argument in the third meditation. And Emerson argues, and Cavell here follows him, this transfer of authorship over our own existence is in fact a betrayal of Descartes' original metaphysical insight in the cogito. If my thinking is the ground of my existence, there is actually no reason why I shouldn't be the author of my existence. And here's a quote, this is Cavell on Emerson, that the human capacity for thought is enough to inspire the authoring of myself is what I take Emerson's Self-Reliance as a reading of Descartes' cogito argument to claim. I take his underlying turning of Descartes to be something like this. There is a sense of being the author of oneself that does not require me to imagine myself God. That may just be the name of the particular picture of the self as a self-present substance, a sense in which the absence of doubt, of which Descartes speaks in proving that God, not he, is the author of himself, is a continuing task. A task in which the goal, or the product of the process, is not a state of being, a self-present substance, but a moment of change, of becoming. Descartes' fallacy here, according to this rather Heideggerian Emerson, consists in mistakenly interpreting himself as a substance that as such can only be created by God. If we abandon this interpretation of the self and cling to the cogito's deep insight that I exist because I think, there's no reason why, to the extent that I'm the author of my thoughts, if I am the author of my thoughts, I'm not also the sufficient author of my own existence. In fact, it probably follows from this line of reasoning that I only exist insofar as I'm the author of my existence. My existence cannot be given by another. That's just the Cartesian meaning of self-reliance as a reading of the cogito, a reading and a twisting of the cogito. And Cavell here continues, quote, "To make sense of this turn of Descartes, Emerson needs a view of the world, a perspective on its fallenness, in which the uncreatedness of the individual manifests itself." You almost hear here Heidegger in Cavell's very American language. To make sense, let me read again. To make sense of this turn of Descartes, Emerson needs a view of the world, a perspective on its fallenness, in which the uncreatedness of the individual manifests itself, in which human life appears as the individual's failure at self-creation, as a continuous loss of individual possibility in the face of some overpowering competitor, end quote. The stance of fallenness, this loss to an overpowering competitor, Emerson then calls conformism, and this term deserves a few comments. First, the loss to an overpowering competitor here, however we're going to construe it, and we will construe it in a second, is still moving within the challenges as they are understood by Descartes himself. The overpowering competitor is nothing but that infamous evil deceiver, representing the possibility that I'm not my thoughts' author, that my mind was created by another who wishes to deceive me. The cogito, the assertion of my existence, is only successful if I have the power to assert that I'm the author of my own thinking, despite the overwhelming power of the evil deceiver, despite the possibility that my thoughts aren't mine. And I take Descartes' transition from the first meditation to the second to be just about that. Second, the stance of conformism, the loss of authorship over my thoughts, brings us back to Tocqueville's analysis of the tyranny of the masses. According to Tocqueville, the tyranny arises once, through Cartesian individual rationalism, all independent metaphysical authority was lost. Oppression thereby became, quote, an affair of the mind rather than the body. The masses' standard of judgment became the only available one. The majority's opinion was internalized. It determined not just what we say, but what we think. My thoughts thereby were authored by the masses, not by myself. That's just the tyranny. But then this tyranny is nothing but Cavell's aforementioned overpowering competitor, in the face of which we lose authorship over our thoughts and our being. And as I just suggested, what is the evil deceiver considered now as a modern possibility, if not the threat that the masses' opinion would be enforced directly on the mind, internalized as a normative force, becoming just like the deceiver, my mind's author? At some point in the essay, Cavell likens Emerson's notion of conformism to what John Stuart Mill calls in On Liberty, the despotism of opinion. This is interesting because Mill actually adopted this notion directly from Tocqueville's Democracy in America, which he had reviewed very favorably, explicitly siding with the book's Tyranny of the Masses thesis. Nevertheless, Emerson and Cavell ultimately must reject Tocqueville's diagnosis that conformism arises from Cartesianism. If anything, it arises from the failure to be properly Cartesian. Conformism doesn't arise from Descartes' allegedly post-metaphysical individual rationalism. It follows rather from the inability to treat our minds as genuinely self-creating, turning instead to merely quoting, say, quoting Descartes' assertion of the cogito, ending up thereby in that metaphysical stance of skepticism which amounts to failing to exist. To understand just how Cartesian Emerson and Cavell here are, it is useful to compare their thinking to a trend that has become, or a trend that has come to define the American mind ever since the Civil War, that is American pragmatism. Pragmatism is profoundly founded on the rejection of Descartes, especially of skepticism and the cogito. So let's take a look in pragmatism. Consider Charles Peirce's, I think, mistakenly celebrated statement, quote, again, the professional philosophers here would remember, "Let us not pretend to doubt in philosophy what we do not doubt in our hearts. Let us not pretend to doubt in philosophy what we do not doubt in our hearts." The difference between Peirce's anti-Cartesian American philosophy and Emerson's American Cartesianism could not be more violent. In Peirce, skepticism is understood as an epistemological doctrine, and a hypocritical one at that. A doctrine one shouldn't waste time on even in philosophy, because it isn't genuinely possible in life. In Emerson, skepticism isn't merely epistemological, it's metaphysical. And despite this fact, the stakes are higher. It isn't just possible in life, it is real. The inability to pronounce my existence amounts to failing to actually exist. Or consider here not just Peirce, but William James's The Will to Believe, that alleged defense of American voluntarism. The heart of James's argument is a distinction he draws between living as opposed to dead options. Living options are choices between two thoughts or propositions that we believe in the sense that we may actually act upon. Dead options are choices between two thoughts or propositions, but one of which isn't genuinely open to a belief on which we may act. But crucially for James, what determines which options are alive and which are dead depends neither on rational evidence nor on our will. It is decided for us beforehand by pre-given beliefs, forms of life, interests, ideologies, namely by what Cavell termed the overpowering competitors that prevent us from being the authors of our own thinking. Worse, the ultimate dead option, according to James, is just this: the choice between skepticism and truth. Our belief that there is truth and that our mind somehow can track it, he says, hasn't been determined on the basis of evidence, nor was it or can it be chosen or ejected by us at will. The belief that our mind can track truth has been decided for us beforehand by our culture, life form, history, and interests. In other words, James dismisses skepticism just like Peirce. Let us not pretend to doubt in philosophy what we cannot doubt in life. In this way, just when the author of Pragmatism presents his alleged defense of American voluntarism, our authorship over our thinking, given this very American right to believe at will, to believe what we want to believe, he actually betrays conformism exactly as Emerson and Cavell understand it. He explained why I'm not the author of my own thoughts. In this view, under pragmatism, again, that defining trend, at least ever since the Civil War, the American mind fails to exist. Cartesianism, however, consists in just the opposite of this approach. If the choice between skepticism and truth is dead because it has been decided for us beforehand, we refuse to accept it. This is Descartes' radical doubt. Descartes' method of radical doubt is nothing but, I'm giving here a title of an essay one day I will write, it's nothing but an exercise in bringing a dead option back to life, refusing to accept the authorship of prior opinions, that evil deceiver over our minds. For Descartes, the first evidence emerges exactly through this exercise. We can be the authors of our own thoughts and hence of our being. The cogito, I am, I exist, a true proposition, thereby gets pronounced. On the basis of this first evidence, we then choose truth rather than skepticism. This Cartesian maneuver was supposed to be the American maneuver. It would have been the cause of anything but tyranny. Tyrannical conformism is a result of its failure, pragmatism. Now, Cavell's interpretation of metaphysical skepticism needs to be seen as a comment on America, I think, not only because we're dealing with an American idol such as Emerson, and not just because we're seeing that through Tocqueville, Descartes becomes an American question. I think there's more to say about this, and I want to tackle that. In Cavell's The Avoidance of Love, a reading of King Lear, a Vietnam-era essay, he incorporates a long digression on America as the ultimate tragic subject. Without mentioning Descartes or Emerson, Cavell explains his country's tragedy by what, in light of the Emerson essay, we cannot but define as a failure to live up to Cartesianism. Because America fails to properly pronounce its existence, it fails to exist. As a result, it haunts the world violently rather than live up to its promise. So let me finish by reading and slightly explaining this longish digression in The Avoidance of Love. Quote from Cavell. Classical tragedies were always national So perhaps it is not surprising that nations have become tragic. And of the great modern nations which have undergone tragedy through inexplicable loss of past or loss of future or self-defeat of promise, in none is tragedy so intertwined with its history and identity as in America. It is cast with uncanny perfection for its role, partly because its power is so awe-inspiring, partly because its self-destruction is so heartbreaking. Before there was Russia, there was Russia. Before there was France and England, there was France and England. But before there was America, there was no America. America was discovered, and what was discovered was not a place, but the backdrop of destiny. The point, so far I take it, is something like that. America is perfectly cast for its tragic role because in Emerson's Heideggerian critique of Descartes, America, or the American nation, cannot be portrayed as a substance that has always existed and therefore could be, so to speak, only created by God. America, thereby, is that subject who is capable of self-creation. And I continue to quote, "Since America had a birth, it may die. It feels mortal. And it wishes proof, not merely of its continuance, but of its existence, a fact that it has never been able to take for granted. Therefore, its need for love is unsustainable. It is a need for love as a proof of its existence, which makes it so frighteningly destructive. This has gone on for a long time. It is maddened now. The love it has had, it has squandered too often. Its young no longer naturally feel it. Its past is in its streets, ungrateful for the fact that 100 years ago it tore itself apart in order not to be divided. What gets described here, I take it, is America's failure to actually exist as a result of its failure to pronounce its existence. Stuck in metaphysical skepticism, being unable to rise up to the Cartesian challenge, America hounds the world violently rather than exists in it." And I continue to quote, that's the last quote, "America was told, as if in a prophecy, that no country is evil which is not imperialist or colonialist. So it turns towards tyranny to prove its virtue. The Yankee is as unpractical as a cavalier, his action as metaphysical as his greatest literature. Yet what needs doing, could he seize his and his world's true need? He could do. No one else so capable of it or so ready for it. He could. It is a free country, but it will take a change of consciousness. So phenomenology becomes politics." Which brings us back to the statement with which I started, psychological, not political, as an ironical twist of Rawls's political, not metaphysical. What in the late 60s gets called phenomenology or a change of consciousness will be interpreted in the 80s as that Cartesian metaphysical challenge to the American mind. And so metaphysics becomes politics. I'm done.
Hi. We're going to take questions now for both talks from Susan and from Omri.
Maybe I should start by saying that our talks were sufficiently related that I seamlessly ran from mine into Omri's without giving Dominic a chance to introduce Omri for those who don't know him. Do you want to do it or should I? Okay, Omri Boehm is a friend of the Einstein Forum, a professor of philosophy at the New School in New York, author of a book about Spinoza's influence on Kant, as well as an extraordinarily unorthodox reading of the Akedah, Abraham's not quite Sacrifice of Isaac, and many, many essays, political essays about both Israel and the United States. Currently working on a book containing those essays, as well as a book on Descartes, who you clearly keep trying to get me to value more than I do. Yeah, do we want to respond to each other first, or let other people jump in?
I responded to you already, so.
Okay, I thought it was a great and rich and dense talk. I'm still not convinced. And one of the, of the claim either about Descartes or about Cavell, and one of the reasons came for me most clearly in the passage you just quoted from The Avoidance of Love, an absolutely gorgeous essay that if you haven't read, one should read. It's a reading of King Lear, and it's one of the best things that Cavell ever wrote. But precisely because he's writing it in the middle of the Vietnam War, there's some things that I find problematic in that quote, which I also went and looked up while I was thinking about what I was going to say. There is a question about how much we should judge an essay written 50 years ago by the standards that we would judge it now. But what leapt out at me was the claim that America was discovered. And before that, there was nothing, you know? And of course, I know what it was like to live in a world where it was possible just to say that. But it does seem to me to only put the problem, and of course, Cavell's writing at a time when the US and Harvard were incredibly polarized with demonstrations and student takeovers of administration buildings and arrests and all of those kinds of things. But to see the problems in terms of America's need for love, right? Which is, of course, how he slips into this wonderful reading of Lear. How he segues from this wonderful reading of Lear to some comments about America and the war, seem to me to betray, I guess, a different form of a Cartesian problem. Namely, and here I guess I would have to side with Tocqueville, that it isn't only the equality of every mind to either exist or know that they exist. I'm not sure about your slide from the one to the other, but let's not problematize that. Which is really to see us in terribly atomistic ways. And of course that's an American thing to do, right? Not to pay, and it's an Emersonian thing to do. That is to say, to complain that people are not the authors of their own thoughts, but they only quote. And it's an interesting question to think about whether or not Emerson is right about that. It's certainly not what I would say about the contemporary American situation and our own little evil deceiver. Right? I miss, again, it's profoundly American, it's profoundly enlightening, but I miss at least a reference, if not to what have been called now, in the intervening 50 years, America's two great original sins, which do color something about it. But the idea that you don't create yourself, and in perhaps a Wittgensteinian sense, we are brought into forms of life and social structures that precede us and to some degree shape us. And I miss that both in Emerson and in Cavell. I guess I'm just riffing a la Cavell off your thoughts there.
I don't have much by means of an answer to this, partly because I have so much by means of an answer, in the sense that I feel I have some thinkings, some thoughts about this that will have to be formulated one day in a longer book, frankly. I'll try to say something about this. Let me start. I think you alluded to this notion. I'll just try to say something about this and move it out of the way. This notion that America was discovered, that today sounds politically incorrect, or exactly, or flat. I'm going to. So I think that's what the debate is going to be about. I think that in the sense that Cavell is talking about here, it is not wrong. And if there is a problem to say it, then it is a problem of political correctness, because he's, and I made sure to actually include that part in the quote so that we're clear, because he's not speaking about the place or the continent, right? He's speaking, America, as he's talking about it, is, if you'd like, a modern Western invention, and it is one he's standing by, I think. And it is one that you're standing by, precisely because of the interesting relation between Descartes and Kant, namely the notion of enlightenment as thinking for oneself. What gets here termed as self-reliance, Descartes' cogito, it's not that it's not far, I take to be in immediate relation and dialogue with Kant's slogan in the Aufklärung essay, have the courage to think for yourself. What does this mean? How does this mean something political, and so forth? The America we're talking about here is not the continent discovered, that would be just false. Yeah. But the notion of beginning a politics on the basis of this Enlightenment idea, rather than, say, revolutionizing France or Germany, right? This is why America is so perfectly cast to its role. Unlike France, there is France. America is trying to begin this Enlightenment experiment in some way. So in that sense, I admit I have less problems, less of an issue with this America was discovered. Putting that aside, let me just say a few words about the question of the relation between our thoughts and the possibility of our thinking, if not in relation to the thinking of others. First, since really I am not far from an expert on Cavell, I should mention that the essay, Being God, Getting Even, actually begins with a quote from James, in which James, I don't remember the quote by heart, I don't know if you remember it now, in which James is actually making that point. He's asking, what is my thinking if it's not my thinking? On the other hand, can I think without the thoughts of others? So Cavell is perfectly aware of this, of this problematic, and I am too. I will make it harder for you by saying that is a problem that haunts also Kant's concept of enlightenment from the get-go. If enlightenment is having the courage to think for myself, can I think for myself genuinely, without the guidance, authority, dialogue with others? And we know the answers. We know the Kantian, from Kant to Habermas, say the answer to that question. I can only think for myself by thinking aloud with other people and so forth. I think the problems for Kant are already deeper. This is why I said it would be difficult to answer you, because I have a lot going on that. I think the problems for Kant are already much more, much deeper than people usually notice. It is not clear that I can come to think for myself on my own, but it is also not clear in what way I can think for myself by just, say, entering the public sphere and thinking with others in dialogue. And I think that Kant works out that problematic in surprising terms, surprisingly near Emerson's terms, namely through the concept of genius in the Critique of Judgment. So I only come to think for myself by accepting the guidance of someone else, someone that I do not necessarily understand in Kant. I'm prepared to defend this as a Kantian thesis. It's not a common reading of Kant, but I would defend it if I had to. Emerson is speaking in similar terms about Descartes. I cannot think for myself if not in relation to Descartes, but it better not be a mere relation of quoting. Somehow, I have to follow Descartes' genius, Descartes' spirit, and this is what I do. Emerson is not thinking alone. He is thinking with Descartes, but not by merely quoting him, but by somehow following his genius by going yet further than that. I think that ought to be the challenge of Emerson as he understands here the American mind, but really of Kant as he understands the slogan, have the courage to think for yourself. Something of that sort. This may have been too brisk for a far-fetched claim. But
I don't want to cut your mic, but we do have some other questions. I know you'd like nothing more than to continue. I would like to hear it too. But first, I want to hear from Josef Furchtel, who had a question. Please wait for the mic.
Sorry. Thank you very much for your inspiring thoughts. Following your reconstruction, would you say in the end that it is the tragedy of America, from a philosophical, metaphysical perspective, that it is the tragedy of America to, how did you express that so nicely, to be, not to study Descartes, but to follow Descartes? Was that the formulation you used? And that means, since Descartes, I try to understand you. I try to get the point. Maybe I misunderstood you. Since Descartes is the one that formulated the problem of skepticism in such an extreme way, in such an extreme way that we, since that time, since the middle of the 17th century, we, the European, North Atlantic, Western world, are struggling with that enormous split between the ego and the non-ego, so bringing up the skepticism problem in the end. Is that the tragedy of America, that they follow metaphysically that fundamental split between the ego and the non-ego? Is that the tragedy?
not the way I understood it. I should say I do not have a worked out understanding of what the tragedy is. My suggestion of how to read it here with Cavell's Descartes is that the tragedy consists in being unable to assert America's existence. And because of this failure, not existing and haunting the world, the consequences of not existing can be pretty violent. And the tragedy arises out of that, the way I understand it. And I will say maybe another word on that. It's possible that that there is actually a double move here. It is possible that there is a metaphysical problem. America doesn't exist because it hasn't asserted its existence. But it's also possible that America's non-metaphysics, post-metaphysics, is actually the reason why it hasn't asserted its existence. I'm not an expert. Let's put it this way. I'm an expert on America just as much as I'm an expert on Cavell, not at all. But in my understanding of America, it started as a deeply metaphysical nation. The American Revolution is a metaphysical revolution. It is tied to a metaphysical assertion. We hold this truth to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed with a creator, with unalienable rights, that among them, this is grounded in either God or nature understood teleologically. You need a robust sense of metaphysics in order to account for American liberalism. And it becomes very difficult to stand by those self-evident truths if you don't have the appropriate metaphysics. The appropriate metaphysics. At least on some historical reading, America has given up on metaphysics through the Civil War. This is my understanding of Louis Menand's the Metaphysical Club, which I admire. It really shows how precisely because of the Civil War, a somewhat revolutionary war fought to defend maybe some metaphysical claim. I understand this can be problematized as well, but at least by some simplistic version of the story, the Civil War was fought to defend a certain metaphysical claim, and this bloody war brought the pragmatism of compromise that undermined America's metaphysical tradition. But this lack of metaphysics just is the inability to assert America, the metaphysical America, that says we hold those truths to be self-evident, right? When liberalism can no longer stand by those truths, it can only stand by what the consensus is about, right? Then America ceased to exist. And its tragedy is caused by that, something like that. Much, not careful enough, but just some thoughts.
From Eilenberger.
Should I?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sollst du?
I'm going to do the what people sometimes call the crazy even, and just go head on and just embrace your challenges. Not quite. About the notion of embodiment as essential here. I think that's just right, and I think that this is that plays an important role also in the essay that I was reading. I could have said more about this. I just left it out for time's sake. Cavell, I think, is incorporating something like the thought that I was trying to ascribe to him into the notion of posture. Having the right posture, this is also something that you find in the Emerson quote, is, I take it, the correct posture of correctly embodying the notion of asserting or pronouncing my existence. Having a certain posture, you can have a good posture or a bad posture, and having a good posture is a way of pronouncing your existence rather than not just in words, right, in that sense. I personally like it because, as Cavell, it turns out, is well aware, it has certain biblical origins, namely in the binding of Isaac. God calls Abraham to this ultimate test and says, Abraham, and Abraham answers, here I am. And if there were a way to hear a posture through words, we don't have, the Bible is not coming with pictures, then you could have seen a picture of the right posture, of the here I am, I'm asserting my existence. Yes to that. Yes, your question about how can I think my own thoughts if not in a certain relation to another. I know how to answer this with Descartes. For better or worse, this other is God for Descartes. But I think in deep and an interesting way, maybe maybe I could make sense of it, say, by alluding to Levinas. And if you go to Levinas, you understand how this other is somehow God. And the cogito gets asserted as really I, but through the other, we can make sense of that. I am not enough of a Cavell expert in order to say how he may or may not now do the same move.
Nur ein Satz dazu. Sagt in diesem Essay, was ist der Skandal des Skeptizismus? Der Außenweltskeptizismus sagt, das ist ein Problem. Aber der Skeptizismus mit gegenüber anderen als erlebt als eine Tragödie. Er sagt Tragedy.
So that's great. That would be very friendly to what I'm trying to do. How did you call this in German? Außenskeptizismus? War das? You know, yeah, I understand, but I'm trying, is this called in German Außenskeptizismus? I take that to be an epistemological problem, and that's somehow precisely the point. We're not speaking about that form of skepticism. We're speaking about something that's more robust. How that gets or needs to be understood in relation to another, I think, is a question we'll have to ask. And again, I know how to answer it, say with Descartes, not with Cavell. Not so much. Elitism. I think that this is what it is in the end. You know, Adorno says somewhere, many people lie already when they say I. That position leads to a certain form of elitism because thinking and existing is an achievement. And I take it, since we started with Tocqueville, it should not be surprising at all that we're finding ourselves orbiting a certain elitist position. But elitism, again, I don't think we should be so afraid of the word. Elitism can mean many things. I'm not sure when you say the elitism Vorwurf, what exactly it's supposed to be now the Vorwurf. But the realization that thinking, or that thinking for ourselves, is a genuine achievement, sounds to me elitist and fine. It's not obvious that everybody just thinks. And the claim that in order to be a subject, we need to think, or at least, that in order to exist as a subject, we need to think, doesn't scare me as a philosophical doctrine. And here is why. Being the good Kantian that I am, that's actually, you know, almost too mild, definitely not an elitist when it comes to human dignity. It has nothing to do with my ability to actually think, to actually realize the achievement that thinking for oneself is. It has to do with my capacity to do that. So a being that's capable, a being that from whom we can demand that they will make this achievement to think for themselves, is the subject of rights, of equality, of dignity, and so forth. Now let's go out and demand that people actually think. Not pretending to having succeeded by the standards that we're seeing here. I definitely do not think most of the time. Maybe I've had a thought in my life. Hopefully a couple, but not much more.
I'd say so.
Anyway, yeah.
I'm going to take final question. No, we only unfortunately have room for one more because we're already running a bit late. But we have one already asked earlier from Eike Brock. Here in the front, sorry.
Vielen Dank. Ich werde auch die Einladung auf Deutsch zu Fragen annehmen.
Kein Problem.
Es sind ähnliche Punkte. Also eigentlich habe ich eine Frage und die Frage lautet, in welche Rubrik philosophisch wäre das Cogito eingeordnet? Das habe ich nicht ganz verstanden. Und ich würde die Frage noch mit ein paar Sätzen begleiten, um es noch ein bisschen klarer zu machen. Also ich glaube, dass dieses Cavellsche Cogito, das in dem Aufsatz wegen Authorship so wichtig ist, und nicht nur in dem Aufsatz, sondern bei Cavell eigentlich immer so wichtig ist, mir kommt es sehr unmetaphysisch vor, würde ich mal sagen. Und zwar, es kommt mir sehr existenzphilosophisch vor. Also auch gerade der Heidegger-Bezug ist, glaube ich, ziemlich stark. Nicht nur, der ist auch da, wenn der von Edgar Allan Poe spricht oder Borderline Letter. Da geht es ja darum, dass dieser Brief auf dem Tisch liegt und den deswegen keiner sieht. Ja, das ist also die Verfallenheit als Mann, glaube ich, was da besprochen wird. Dass wir eben meistens, oder bei Thoreau, die meisten Menschen leben in stiller Verzweiflung. Übrigens, das ist der Punkt, ich glaube, mit dem Biolizismus ist wirklich die Ansage, die meisten Menschen leben in Verzweiflung. Oder bei Kierkegaard, der bei Cavell viel zu selten gesehen wird, alle Menschen sind verzweifelt, nur eben uneigentlich verzweifelt, sie wissen es nicht. Ja? Ich glaube, diese ganzen Dinge spielen da im Hintergrund. Und jetzt ist aber die Frage, ist das wirklich ein metaphysisches Cogito? Oder habe ich mich da glaube, irgendwie nur habe ich das auch falsch verstanden, denn es geht doch darum, auch bei heiliger Geworfenheit. Bei Descartes wird auch nur die Form gerettet. Also cogito ego sum ego existum ist ja nur formal wird gerettet, dass da ein denkendes, eine Res cogitans ist, aber was sie denkt, auch über sich selbst denkt, ist ja damit nicht gerettet. Dafür braucht er ja Gott, der die Außenwelt rettet und damit wird mein Leben wieder meins. Weil das kein böser Dämon, kein Genius Maleficus erzählt, sondern weil Gott eben garantiert, dass ich nicht deswegen kann betrügen. Und bei Cavell habe ich das Gefühl, es geht darum, einen performativen Akt im Ich Bin sagen und damit die Transzendenz zu verabschieden und in der Immanenz sich selbst sich anzueignen. Also eine Affirmation des Selbst, aber ohne Transzendenz. Und dann kommt das, was gerade Wolfgang gesagt hat, der Leiblichkeit und dem aufrechten Position. Da wird es nämlich dann auch leiblich, dann ist es auch die Art und Weise, wie man für sich selbst einsteht in der Welt. Also ich würde sagen, das ist irgendwie nicht metaphysisch, aber ja, das ist die Frage.
I'm not sure that I completely understand the question. I mean, it's metaphysical. The cogito is understood here as metaphysical in the sense that it grounds existence rather than epistemology. So the question is not how do I know that I exist, but how do I exist? It's metaphysical in that sense. So far?
That's what I understood, but I doubt that that's metaphysical.
Say more. So okay. So listen. So this is going to be a semantic argument. If metaphysics is a study of substance, as Aristotle understands it, it's not metaphysical. If metaphysics is about the conditions of existence rather than knowledge, then it's metaphysics.
Okay. Then I would totally agree with your argument, but I'm still not convinced that it's metaphysical. Okay. Maybe we can discuss it.
Certainly.
We're going to wrap up this session and take a very short break before coming back, let's say 5 minutes before coming back for Josef Fürchtel. Before we do that, though, I wanted to thank Omri and Susan for talking here tonight.